So if I say the Garden of Eden, you're probably already picturing it. A garden, a tree, Eve holding a shiny red apple, maybe with a bite out of it. But here's the strange part. The Bible never actually mentions an apple. Not once. Not in Genesis. Not anywhere. And once you notice that, the story really starts to shift, because suddenly you realize this might not be a story about food at all. Because how we picture this moment shapes how we understand the very first human choice in the Bible. And if this is about curiosity and a piece of fruit, well, that's one thing. And that means you would kind of look at things totally differently. But if it's actually about authority, about who gets to define good and evil, that's something very, very different. So let's slow down and look at what Genesis actually says and what it very intentionally does not say. So Genesis never actually names the fruit. The Hebrew word used is peri, and that word is just like completely generic. It just means fruit, or more broadly, what something produces. No species, no description, no emphasis on the object itself. So if you've already assumed apple, you didn't misread the scripture. You just inherited an image that you've heard passed down for many generations. So where did the idea of the apple actually come from? And I promise this is not a big conspiracy that the church is trying to trick you that it's an apple. Part of it actually comes from the Latin. In Latin, the word malum can mean apple, and it can also mean evil. I thought this was really interesting. And the overlap stuck, especially in medieval Europe. And apples were just like super common. And they were easy to recognize and easy to paint. So artists just started using apples to visually represent the story, especially at a time when most people couldn't read. And for centuries, art was theology for the illiterate. And those images shaped how people imagined the Bible long before they could actually read it themselves. And eventually the image became so dominant that people just assumed that it came from scripture, even though it didn't. So the real question isn't, why wasn't it an apple? The better question is, why didn't the Bible bother telling us what kind of fruit was it at all? And you may be wondering this, well, what was it then? But to answer this, we have to look at the Hebrew word peri that shows up all over the Old Testament and give it a comparison. Sometimes it means literal fruit, but other times and often it actually just means outcome. For example, the fruit of the womb, the fruit of the land, the fruit of your labor. It's not about what something is per se, and they're not necessarily being literal. It's about what produces, not produce. Did you get that one? So when Genesis talks about the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the emphasis isn't on the object. It's on the result of taking it, which makes a lot of sense when we see what happens after Adam and Eve eat it. Here's something we miss as modern readers though. Ancient readers would not have been asking the question, okay, but what kind of fruit was it? We want to know. That question wouldn't even register in their thought process. In the ancient world, stories like this weren't read like scientific reports. They were read for meaning, not mechanics. And when they heard fruit, they heard outcome, consequence, a warning. And trees were common images for life, wisdom, and authority. So the tension of the story isn't appetite. Is it possible this wasn't even about a literal piece of fruit at all? Well, the text actually doesn't force us to decide that, and Genesis never emphasizes the physical act of eating. The focus is entirely on the decision, and in the ancient world, knowing good and evil meant moral authority. So then it begs the question, who defines it? Who decides what is right? Who decides what's wrong? Up to this point, God does. And the serpent doesn't say, eat this. He says, did God really say? So that just ties it all together. It's a challenge to trust. And this is where it connects to Jesus. When Jesus talks about bearing fruit, he's not talking about behavior checklists. He's talking about what your life produces. Good trees produce good fruit. Bad trees produce bad fruit. The same metaphor, same logic. Fruit reveals source. Genesis opens the Bible with humans choosing their own definition of good and evil. And this is where the problem begins. And Jesus later says you can recognize a tree by its fruit. Not labels, not appearances, but outcomes. So honestly, once you realize the Bible never cared what the fruit was, Genesis stops feeling childish. The danger was never the object. It was the decision to take moral authority into human hands. And that's why scripture leaves the fruit unnamed. Because if we fixate on the apple, we miss the whole point. And that point is still with us.